Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our Farm to Focus webinar. We will give everyone a couple more minutes to join the webinar, and we will start in approximately 2 minutes to kick off the event. Thank you. Good afternoon again. Good afternoon again. My name is Samantha Turner, Director of Communications for Missouri Soybeans. Thank you again for joining our webinar this afternoon. I thank Matt Amick for hosting with Missouri Soybeans, Director of New Uses and Biofuels, as well as Scott Fenwick, Technical Director for Clean Fuels, and Alan Rubber, Senior Feedstock Advisor for Clean Fuels as well. So thank you for your time. We hope you enjoy today's session. We will be doing a giveaway at the end of our webinar today for a Carhartt backpack. So thanks for attending and participating in this webinar. We will also have a Q&A session at the end. So please put any questions you have in our chat box and Matt will get those answered or get them to the proper spokespeople to get those answered for you. At this time, I'll kick it over to Matt to start our Farm and Focus webinar.
Thank you, Samantha, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Well, the fuel market is changing. Right now, it's tough to even have a conversation about fuel. The current situation in the market with high prices and tight supplies of diesel and gasoline presents a significant amount of pressure on farmers, consumers, and businesses. Additionally, with the emphasis on lowering our carbon footprint from both corporate America and policymakers at the state and federal levels, biodiesel, as well as other soy-based fuels like renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, have opportunities to be integrated into our fuel supply as a cleaner, renewable option. But it's more complicated to electrify heavy-duty diesel trucks and equipment, locomotives, marine vessels, and airplanes. So governments and corporations are recognizing that they will need a different solution to meet carbon reduction goals aside from electric vehicles. So for farmers, our environment, and the global fuel market, it's imperative to have an accessible, locally produced fuel option. And this is where biodiesel can capitalize in a big way as a better, cleaner option that is accessible right now. Additionally, by having these fuels in our energy mix, there is an additional cost savings by adding to and extending this to the supply of petroleum diesel fuel. But the bottom line is these changes in the marketplace should prime soybean farmers to have strong demand for years to come. And biodiesel is positioned well to be the fuel of now and into the future. But that is why we've gathered here today to go more in depth on those developments from our expert panel and showcase how this will impact farmers moving forward. So let's dig into the program. I'd first like to introduce our first speaker, who is Scott Fenwick. Scott is the Technical Director for Clean Fuels Alliance America, formerly the National Biodiesel Board, the trade association representing biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel stakeholders within North America. Scott leads the advancement of core member services for technical, quality assurance, and operations support issues. He provides key support for technical aspects needed by renewable fuel stakeholders to effectively position the industry, educates key decision makers, and helps build industry credibility, along with overseeing the biodiesel quality program known as the BQ 9000 program. Scott, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate that. And let me shorten that intro a little bit more. Is basically just to say that my role, with the organization is to make sure there's no barriers so that soybean farmers today can't sell more and more of their soybeans, and we can't produce more and more renewable fuels like biodiesel. So really appreciate being here with everyone today. Thank you. And hopefully we can help answer a few questions you might have about the industry and where it's heading. So as Matt said, Clean Fuels was known as the National Biodiesel Board. We're in the midst and changed our name back in January at our annual conference, Clean Fuels Alliance America. And we came out with a vision back in 2020. Alan helped develop here, which basically says that where we're at today, or where we were at the time, we want to grow, and we wanted to double in size to be 6 billion gallons by the year 2030. That includes volumes and gallons of biodiesel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, and then incorporating my role. Basically, we want to see those fuels used in on-road, off-road, aviation fuel, power generation, home heating applications, railroads, marine, anything that is diesel fuel powered. There's absolutely no reason why you can't use and substitute biodiesel, renewable diesel, or sustainable aviation fuel. So those advancements are being driven by the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which at 6 billion gallons would be over 35 million metric tons. And with Alan's help and some significant advancements in feedstocks, we hope to be able to hit 15 billion gallons by the year 2050. So that's a pretty lofty goal, and we're going to absolutely have to rely on soybean farmers across the country to help us get there. This is where we're at today. And from a federal perspective, the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS, is what creates that floor for volumes of renewable fuels. Biodiesel specifically plays in a category called biomass-based diesel fuel, which is both biodiesel and renewable diesel. But then there's a subset, what's known as advanced biofuels, which are those renewable fuels that provide at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so biodiesel can play in that bucket as well. So those are designated by D4 and D5 RIN categories. And that's a little bit more complicated than I think we want to get into here. But D6 is some older fuels that were grandfathered into the program originally. But this shows you a graph of the last 10, 13 years or so, and the steep increases that we made in some year after years. Where you do see plateaus is typically indicative of changes in policy. In addition to the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, we also have the Biodiesel Blenders Tax Credit, or the BTC, and that's legislation passed by Congress. Typically, it's been year on year, and some years that tax credit has been allowed to lapse. When it does is typically where you see that plateau or downward trends in the market here. The last time was 2017. That was allowed to expire, and we actually went 2 years without that tax credit. Congress did pass it again, and each time they have come back and reinstated that tax credit, they've done so retroactively. So there would not be a lapse in the marketplace. And so end of 2017, end of 2019, when they reinstated it, it was 2 years retroactive to cover 17 and 18, and then 3 years forward, meaning that's set to expire here at the end of this year, 2022, once again. So Clean Fuels actually just had its membership meeting in Washington, D.C. just last week, where we set up several meetings Matt was involved several meetings on Capitol Hill to meet with a bunch of senators and representatives from the states that we represent and have a footprint in through all of our members. And so we're already beginning to push for a reinstatement of that tax credit and an extension of the RFS after this year. And so we expect to see these volumes grow. It's interesting to note 2021 isn't actually on here, but if it were, those volumes this past year are about 3.2 billion gallons. So we are continuing to see growth across the industry. In addition to the federal policies, state policies play an increasing part of our industry as well. And so for 2020, of that RFS volume, where we were just under or right at 3 billion gallons, 1.9 billion of those gallons played a significant part in helping different states meet their target requirements. And those could be mandates, such as Minnesota, where they actually have a B20 mandate 6 months out of the year. That reverts to B5 in colder weather months. It could be Illinois and its strong motor fuel tax exemption for blends of B11 and higher. And that was recently increased through some legislation just this last couple months. Or places like California, Oregon, where they have a low carbon fuel standard that begins to place value on carbon credits based upon the low carbon intensity of our fuels. And so some of these credits are stackable, whether or not it be state credits, the blender's tax credit. And so there can be some significant tax savings in different parts of the country, depending upon which of these programs you're playing under. By 2030, we expect the state markets to account for over 5 billion gallons of demand. And so these aren't just guesses. We're not just throwing darts, at a dartboard. Our state regulatory program is pretty confident in these. The one that we've recently pointed out as missing, really, that you and your leadership have been involved with has been Missouri. And so Missouri legislation, I'm sure you're aware, has been passed that will create some retail incentives across the state. And so that's waiting and sitting on the governor's desk. And we expect him to be able to sign that here in the next couple of weeks. And we'll be adding that to this graph as well. So some of the other things that are driving our industry. Obviously, biodiesel's been in the marketplace for over 2 decades and has gotten us to where we're at. But you're probably reading headlines about local refineries across the country that are beginning to produce and beginning to build out renewable diesel facilities. There is a difference between biodiesel and renewable diesel. We use the same feedstocks, and Alan's going to touch upon those in a little bit. But that soybean oil that's used to produce biodiesel, if it's used in a renewable diesel facility, which is a lot more, almost identical to a petroleum refinery, then it goes through a hydro processing unit where the oxygen content is removed from that veg oil or animal fat and turned into a hydrocarbon. In fact, renewable diesel, when it becomes blended with petroleum diesel fuel, is indistinguishable. You cannot physically separate those. And in fact, the only way to determine the renewable diesel content in a blend would be through carbon dating, a portion of that fuel to determine that. So we've got renewable diesel, we've got renewable diesel, biodiesel, sustainable aviation fuels, very similar to renewable diesel. It must be made in a petroleum type refinery. And that's got even more processing than what renewable diesel would have. So that's processed to the point where the cold flow characteristics would allow for use in planes and jets at 40,000 feet, where the temperatures can be -40, -45 degrees. And so the processing there just isn't capable with today's biodiesel. And so, but they are all going to be competing for the same feedstocks that we've been using to produce biodiesel to date. Some of the announcements in the industry about those producing renewable diesel, and you see some of their logos here. Diamond Green Diesel was the first really, or one of the first purpose-built facilities down in Louisiana. REG has one as well, Renewable Energy Group. Diamond Green Diesel has gone through several expansions now. They're producing nearly 700 million gallons of renewable diesel, and they've now broken ground on another facility east of Houston in Port Arthur to build their second site. Phillips 66 is producing renewable diesel out in California, part of the California LCFS. Marathon plans to build upon one of their facilities out there as well. In addition, Marathon took one of their smaller refineries in Dickinson, North Dakota, converted that into a renewable diesel facility. They no longer process petroleum there, and they're producing another 100 million gallons or so up there. A lot of competition. Holly Frontier bought Sinclair recently. Sinclair had a renewable diesel facility in Wyoming. Holly Frontier has their own plans as well. And so we are seeing quite a bit of growth, quite a bit of announcements. But not all of these announcements are going to lead to volumes by each and every one of these refiners. And I point that out with CVR. CVR had made some announcements to retrofit and expand upon a couple refineries they have. But due to some of the high feedstock costs that began to kick into the marketplace because of these announcements a year ago, CVR has put their plans on hold indefinitely before they finish their facilities and their plans. If you were to take all of these announcements, add them up, probably 5 billion gallons, over 5 billion gallons. And I mentioned we're at 3.2 today. We'd certainly hit our target of 6 well before 2030, and we fully expect to do so. When we first placed that vision into effect, we were thinking later this decade, 2028, 2029, we'd hit that vision. It now looks a lot closer like we're going to hit that mid-decade, end of 2024, 2025 maybe, where we hit 6 billion gallons as an industry. And the reason, like I say, are global opportunities. My role within the program is to help ensure that there are no technical barriers to include biodiesel or renewable diesel, at least up to 20%, higher in many cases, in on and off-road, heating oil. I mentioned marine, locomotives, power generation. And as this engine technology changes, really we've got to continue to reprove ourselves. The EPA continues to tighten emissions regulations for on and off-road vehicles. And so beginning 2027, there'll be a whole new set of emissions after treatment devices on board your vehicles. They'll be, once they're proven in on-road technology, they'll be moving towards off-road into the ag and construction equipment as well. And so probably by 2030, you'll begin to see new emissions after treatment devices on a lot of your farm equipment. We're already working with those vehicle and engine manufacturers to begin proving out their new equipment that you won't see in the marketplace yet until 2027, but we're already testing B20 in that today. It's interesting in that all of these new applications that we've got new data for, new research, new partners, comes likely at the expense of the on-road market. Traditionally, up until today, nearly 90% of the biodiesel produced domestically has been used and sold by large truck stop operators. These new markets like locomotives and marine and heating oil market, it's going to continue to grow, is going to help not only drive growth in feedstocks and soybean oil consumption, but it's also going to produce a little bit of competition for what applications these fuels are sold in. If you were to listen to today's administration and the Department of Energy, they would tell you they would love to electrify everything in on and off-road applications. Where they see the difficulty really is going to be railroads, marine, and aviation. But even if they could, and not that I think they can, but even if they could, those markets alone are so hard to electrify that between aviation maritime and rail, and even Class 8 trucks, long haul trucks. We're talking about 60 to 70 billion gallon markets for biodiesel and renewable diesel to play in. And then when I say that, it means significant market opportunities for soybeans and soybean farmers to come, years and decades ahead. There is absolutely no way we'll be able to electrify all of these market segments. So in spite of what you might hear about how liquid fuels are dying, combustion is dead, that's far from the truth. And we expect liquid renewable fuels to fill in more and more volumes as we move forward. Really the reason why we talked about federal and state programs, those have been the primary drivers up until now, but we're seeing a trend and changes in the marketplace that there's new corporate pressure. These environmental, social, and governance programs, or you may have heard of ESG. Really what that stands for is environmental justice. Low income neighborhoods. There is increased demand for low carbon fuels that can make a benefit, or have a benefit to environmental and health, like biodiesel can. And so a lot of our reports lately have been focused on the health benefits of biodiesel, reducing lung issues, asthma, lung cancer, and applying government government accounting rules to that, where we can demonstrate billions of dollars in healthcare savings and lost workday from switching to biodiesel. And so these environmental, social, and governance programs are being led by today's largest shippers: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Walmart. They've got their own sustainability goals and decarbonization goals, and they're demanding their shipping companies implement similar goals. And so it's no longer good enough for these companies to just sit back and wait on government programs to decarbonize. Walmart and Amazon are demanding that of the railroads and their shipping companies. And so what we're seeing is global shipping companies, Maersk, Stolt, these large container ships, now have goals and are working to use 100% biofuels and biodiesel in their ships. Just on a call earlier this morning where they're working towards changing those global marine fuel specs. And the next version of that, that's going to be published here at the end of next year, will allow 100% biodiesel to be used as a fuel in all marine vessels around the world. But why the change of heart? I mentioned, we talk about electrification, a lot of talk about electrification, but you can't electrify everything. And so really what it comes down to is that liquid renewable fuels like biodiesel are the lowest cost drop-in solution to reduce carbon today. Add to that the cost savings against electrification, the performance benefit, the environmental, the health benefits. There's more demand for biodiesel and renewable diesel today than there was just a couple of years ago. And we expect to see a lot of continued growth. Matt, I'll toss it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. A lot of great opportunities out there for soybean farmers and for the various biomass-based diesel options that we have out there in the marketplace. And now what we wanted to do is pass it over to Alan Weber to talk about the impact of all this to the farming community. And Alan is a founding partner of Mark IV, which is a Missouri-based firm that works to help commercialize industrial products from agriculture. He has spent a large part of his career working within the biodiesel industry. He farms with his family in central Missouri, and Alan is an agricultural economist by training and completed his graduate work at the University of Missouri. Alan, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, perfect, and thanks, Matt. Always great to follow Scott because he gave you a really nice overview of the differences between biodiesel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, and then gave you some insights as to those marketplaces that we're both commercializing as well as exploring right now. And he highlighted the vision for our industry, which is to more than double by 2030. And of course, our ability to be able to more than double is highly dependent upon feedstock supplies. So I thought that's where I'll start, is taking a look at last year in terms of feedstocks that we used. So what you see in front of you is feedstock pathways, which have been approved by EPA. So these are eligible feedstocks to be used under the renewable fuel standard here in the United States. And what you obviously see, this is from 2021, that soybean oil remains a predominant feedstock that we use here in the United States, slightly under 15% back there in 2021. After that, I usually refer to what I call my 315s. So 3 sets of feedstocks, which are about 15% of the marketplace, each of them. And that would be used cooking oil, or sometimes you might hear it referred to as yellow grease, animal fats, and then also distillers corn oil, which of course is a co-product of the ethanol or the corn-based dry grind ethanol industry. Canola oil, which of course is primarily grown in the upper Midwest and North Dakota as a spring crop, typically represents somewhere between 5 to 7% of the feedstock that we use here in the US. And then one crop that's on the screen there that you may not be as familiar with as a producer here in the state of Missouri, and that's camelina. So camelina has an approved pathway, primarily a crop that would be raised as a winter annual in the Pacific Northwest, so think Montana. And there's currently not significant commercial production here in the US, but there is at least one company that is working to commercialize that crop to be grown as a low carbon intensity feedstock. So that kind of gives us an idea of where feedstocks were back in 2021. But if we do look into 2022, you'll see that we have a little bit of an uptick in terms of use of soybean oil through the first 5 months. So you heard Scott say that in 2020, we used about 3 billion gallons of biodiesel, renewable diesel in the US. We had a slight increase last year in 2021, about 3.2 billion gallons. And through the first 5 months of the year, we've seen about an 18 to 20% increase in terms of the use here in the US. So, the fact that we're using more soybean oil is a trend I actually think will continue into the future. If you think about some of the other feedstocks that we use, think animal fats, think used cooking oil. We're not necessarily, just because there's more biodiesel demand, we don't necessarily eat more pork chops. We don't necessarily go to McDonald's and order a second set of French fries. So there's a little bit of a lack of supply response, but we do have that potential for a supply response, even though the soybean industry is still driven in terms of crush by protein demand. We do see that that does have an impact whenever we use additional volumes of soybean oil. The other thing which has occurred over the last 18 months or so is the announcements of additional crush facilities here in the US. And I think a lot of that has been due to the biofuels market here in the US. So we have seen both expansions as well as new crush announcements. Significant from my perspective, something I haven't necessarily seen in my career. If you think about it, we have 18 either expansions or new facilities which have been announced or are under construction, 10 different states, representing more than 600 million bushels of additional crush capacity, and at least probably a little bit more than $4.5 billion of investment in terms of our rural communities. That's close to a 30% expansion in US crush by 2026. So you think of it from that perspective, and that's another reason why I continue to believe that soybean oil will increase in terms of its use over the next few years. A little bit more locally, of course, we've had the announcement down in Southeast Missouri in terms of a new crush facility, 60 million gallons, so representing close to 100 million gallons of additional feedstock. So my point really is that soybean oil has been, and in my estimation, will remain an important and vital feedstock as we look into the future to be able to more than double the size of our industry. Now, Matt had asked me to provide some thoughts from a grower's perspective on the impacts of increased biodiesel and renewable diesel production. So I thought I would just talk a little bit, highlight some of the things that I think about as a grower. Matt had mentioned the fact that I Work with my father on our farm in Northeast Pettis County. We're a diversified crop and livestock farm. And so all of this hits home for me about the same way it does in your pocketbook as well. One of the things I thought I would kind of start off with is something you may not think about day in and day out. And I'm going to start with risk mitigation. So the fact that we have a growing and prolific biodiesel, renewable diesel industry actually serves as a great hedge against inflation. I've talked about this for several years, but this year, unfortunately, it really hits home. I had to put on some urea this year at a little bit more than $1 a pound or $1 a unit. So that's the highest prices I've ever had to pay. Just had some diesel fuel delivered more than $5 a gallon to the farm. So we are seeing increased energy values on a global basis. It's been a few years, but a few years ago, I took a look at our inputs at the farm level, and more than 70% of our inputs are directly linked to energy values. So that would be our fuel, our fertilizer, our herbicides, our fungicides. So I can also look back into history and point to times in which we had high energy values. So therefore our inputs were going up in terms of costs. But at the same point in time, we were producing pretty large crops. And so we actually had an oversupply and we had low commodity values. So during those timeframes, we were effectively squeezed as growers in terms of our margins. So that's one of the things that the biodiesel and renewable diesel industries have done for us as growers, is we've now given an energy value to fats and oils. So those two commodities are in fact correlated. They move together for the most part. So as we've seen increased natural gas prices, increased crude oil values, should not be surprising to any of us on the call today that we've also seen increased commodity values. So that's helped us even at a point in time in which we have had a couple of 4 billion plus bushel crops in the US. And if Mother Nature would cooperate, expecting a even larger crop this year here in the US for soy, that even though we have these very large crops, that we've also had firm pricing. So risk mitigation or a hedge from my perspective is vitally important. But I know that also price is important as well in terms of that impact on a per bushel basis. So it really begs the question of what would happen to our commodity values, soybeans specifically, if we didn't have demand, such as from the renewable fuel standard. And we have looked at that from an economic perspective. Worked with a firm out of Kansas City, StoneX, some of you may be familiar, and we asked them the question to look at it from a modeling perspective, is what would happen if we lost demand for soy oil from the renewable fuel standard. And this has been a couple of years ago, back in 2019, but when they looked at that demand, and the initial impact would be to decrease our prices 11 to 13% at the local level. So if you think about prices back in 2019, that was somewhere between $1 to $1.50 a bushel. So just think of that from your perspective. What's your production at your farm level? Is it 10,000 bushels, 20,000 bushels of soybeans? If you're in the 400 acre range, something like that for beans, 20,000 bushels, that's a $30,000 impact in terms of the bottom line on your operation. Sticking with the theme of prices, that impact goes beyond just our commodity values. Obviously, right now, when we look at the global situation for fuel, and Scott touched on this in terms of diesel fuel prices, we're at some really high levels in terms of distillate demand and distillate prices. But the choke point has been supplies. And even in the US, it's not just supplies, but it's also refinery capacity. So what biodiesel and renewable diesel has done for us as an industry is it's effectively added decentralized refinery capacity in the US. So when we look at that production and demand here in the US in terms of impact on prices, if we did not have that additional capacity, our distillate prices would probably be at least 4% higher, or bringing it back to what we pay in terms of bills represents probably more than 20 cents a gallon in terms of fuel prices. So no matter how high prices are right now, add 20 cents to that if you think about it from the perspective of where we would be without having this additional capacity and production here in the US. So really, if you think about it, those first 3 points, they impact us directly in terms of our farm. It gives us a hedge against rising energy values. It's added value to the price of our beans, and it's also helped to keep diesel fuel prices under control. But I don't want to stop there. I want to think just about a couple other things to keep in mind that goes beyond just our direct farm. The first one is thinking about the areas that we live, our rural economies. If I think back down to Southeast Missouri, where we've got that new crush facility announced, roughly 90 to 95 million gallons of additional vegetable oil production. If you think about that in terms of the amount of jobs that we support in the state, if that production would go into biodiesel production, that represents more than 3,000, around 3,200 jobs that we support across the state in terms of the production, the processing, and then the production and the fuel and use. So that's a huge impact. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight before turning it back over to Matt is let's not forget about our livestock partners in all this. And I know John Clybaker, I saw that you were on the call. My guess is you'll probably agree with me on this, is that, it's not just about the row crop production. I think most of us, either we are diversified, we have a neighbor that has livestock production, or at least we know somebody that's a livestock producer. And if you ever come across somebody, as you're talking in the elevator line or at the coffee shop, that somehow implies that biodiesel or renewable diesel production is not good for a livestock producer, if you could nicely, but quickly, rebut that point. There are at least two significant ways in which we have positive impacts for livestock producers. And Scott, if you could roll me forward one last slide. I know that all of you on this call know this, but it's something that for a lot of non-ag audiences, we have to educate and explain that every time that we take a bushel of soybeans into an oilseed processing facility, not only do we get a certain amount of meal, we get a corresponding amount of oil, right? It's two peas in a pod. They both have to occur at the same time. So when we think about the global demand for protein, that if we did not have demand for biodiesel and renewable diesel, the value of the oil, because of the oversupply, would depress those prices. That's essentially the situation we were in 20 years ago. Oilseed processors, to be able to operate, need to be able to make a certain margin. If the prices for soybean oil are depressed, that means that soybean meal has to be higher in terms of value. Or said conversely, that because soybean oil is now carrying its fair share of crush margins, we know that we're helping to keep soybean meal values cost competitive for growers. So we're able to keep those prices cost competitive. And if you go to the very beginning of my comments, animal fats are a very important feedstock for biodiesel and renewable diesel producers. And because of the fact that we've been able to effectively increase the value of animal fats, we've increased the drop value or the carcass value for livestock producers. So we've effectively been able to help increase their revenues on a per animal basis, and at the same point in time, keep all of their costs very competitive on the feed side. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to you for comments and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that last comment about the livestock producers. That's an important aspect that we need to remember in such a strong livestock state like Missouri. And it's just tremendous opportunities all across the ag sector here for some of these biodiesel, renewable diesel, and others. So I will have a short presentation here coming along, but if you do have questions, please place those in the chat. We will get to those at the end. We will also stay on to the end. We'll be giving away a nice Carhartt backpack. I've got it right here for you to look at. So stay on the end. We'll give that away. Remember, any questions in the chat. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up. I wanted to give a short overview of what's going on in Missouri on biodiesel. And I'll share my presentation right here. So as you know, Missouri is a strong biodiesel state. We are ranked number 3 in the U.S. in biodiesel production capacity, just behind Iowa and Texas. And currently we have 5 active plants, 2 of those that are majority farmer owned, Mid-America Biofuels in Mexico, Missouri, and Paseo Cargill Energy in Kansas City. And so these 5 plants combined have a production capacity of just under 250 million gallons. So we've expanded over the last several years, and it's a great story to tell. As we know, another great story to tell, the biodiesel industry was born in Missouri. Some of the initial research was started at the University of Missouri, coming from checkoff dollars supported by Missouri soybean farmers. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary this past in 2021. And so it's a great story to tell. We continue to see advancements in the industry. The biodiesel of 15, 20 years ago is much different than the biodiesel we have now. High quality, some of the programs that Scott runs through his office, the BQ 9000 program, the biodiesel is excellent quality across the board. The economic impact, Alan touched on this a little bit, $1.3 billion industry in the state, 3,200 jobs. And we do have a partner we work with here in the state, the Biodiesel Coalition of Missouri, which was formed in 2018 with various stakeholders, including some biodiesel plants, fuel suppliers across the state, and soybean farmers, to really grow the biodiesel industry and support the commercial success of biodiesel. And I serve as the executive director of the Biodiesel Coalition of Missouri, as long as my duties with Missouri Soybean. So just a few updates, and Scott alluded to this a little bit on the in the legislative session this past year. So we ended 2022 legislative session with a great success. We were able to get the biodiesel incentive legislation passed through the House and Senate. This was part of an ag omnibus package that included several other pieces of legislation. And if you tuned into our last Farm to Focus, you heard a little bit about that from our bill sponsors, which were Senator Jason Bean from Southeast Missouri, Representative Brad Pollitt from Central Missouri, and then also Representative Mike Hafner from the western part of the state, who was very instrumental in getting that legislation passed. So what that means is that fuel suppliers or folks that are offering biodiesel at the retail level, if they blend in the range of B5 to B10, which is 5% biodiesel to 10% biodiesel, they can get a 2-cent incentive or retail tax credit from that blending. Also, if they choose to blend higher than B11, they would receive a 5-cent retail tax credit. Additionally, in that legislation, that included a production tax credit. So 2 cents per gallon for every gallon produced from the biodiesel plants qualifies for a production tax credit. So these are great ways to provide more access to biodiesel across the state, to continue to lower the cost of fuel across the state for biodiesel and diesel fuel, and just a great way to get more biodiesel into the marketplace. And we are, as Scott alluded to, we're awaiting action from Governor Parson on that bill. Additionally, another way that we are working to build access to biodiesel is through infrastructure grants. And so this is the second year that we'll be seeing programs that offer a state infrastructure grant and a federal infrastructure grant to entities, whether it be a terminal, a fuel supplier, a fleet, whoever that might be that wants to offer biodiesel or use biodiesel. There will be grants available, likely this fall. Excuse me, sorry about that. 2 programs, one at the federal level, the USDA Higher Blends Infrastructure Incentive Program. There'll be at least $100 million available for biofuels infrastructure. And we're hopeful that we can work through that program to get some biodiesel grants. Additionally, here in the state, MASBA, the Missouri Ag and Small Business Development Authority, through the Department of Agriculture, will be offering their biofuels infrastructure incentive program for the second year. And we were able to secure over $4 million in the state budget this past year, thanks to work from Casey Wasser at Missouri Soybeans and others, to get that through. And we're happy to offer that again this year. So my key takeaway for this is, if you work with a fuel supplier, or if you know a fuel supplier or a fleet or anyone, share this information. It should be available early fall, and we'll be able to get that out to all of our stakeholders. Some of the other activities and resources that we offer, we work with fleets in any form or fashion. We have access to Scott and others at the Clean Fuels Alliance America, and we're happy to do trainings, education. We do some diesel mechanic education with some of the training schools across the state. Just a couple examples of some of the fleets we've worked with recently that have made that switch to biodiesel: Cole County Public Works Department, Scotland County Public Works Department, the city of Jefferson, among many others. So we're continuing to do that work across the state, and any leads that any of you have or any folks that we can work with, please send them our way. Additionally, we're working with the folks that are using biodiesel as a spokesperson to help spread the good message of biodiesel. And that includes a lot of the retailers that are out there providing testimonials. You'll see on the screen, including James Greer, MFA Oil, a great partner of ours. They did a video. If you go to the Missouri Soybeans page on YouTube or any of our social media outlets, you can find those videos talking about the impact of biodiesel, the importance of biodiesel. We've worked with Casey's, with Ozarks Petroleum and others, and we're happy to work with anybody that wants to offer biodiesel. In the last slide, I forgot to mention it, but one of those entities is Deluxe Truck Stop, who is located in St. Joseph, Missouri, and they were able to secure one of the infrastructure grants. They put in a blending infrastructure to work. They can blend anywhere from B0 all the way up to B20 anytime they want to. And they're going to be, they're surrounded by the AGP biodiesel plant. There's several grain elevators, some slaughter facilities down where they're at. So there's a lot of trucks moving in and out, and they are able to offer biodiesel to those semis rolling through that area. Additionally, for any resource or information that you need on biodiesel, please go to the Biodiesel Coalition of Missouri website, missouribiodiesel.org. You will also find an interactive map where you can find retail facilities, fuel suppliers, and others that offer biodiesel. As Scott mentioned, most of the biodiesel flowing through the state is going through truck stops like Love's, Casey's, the MFA Oil locations, Pilot, places like that. You're seeing them blending upwards of 10, 15, 20% biodiesel. And just to wrap it up, I've got some homework for everybody on the call, if you wouldn't mind. If you buy diesel fuel and use diesel fuel, please ask for biodiesel. We cannot, if we hear from fuel suppliers that folks aren't asking for it, it makes it sort of a chicken and the egg scenario where we can't. We need people asking for it so that they know that there's demand out there for bio. Please share information with your local fuel supplier, with your county commission, your local municipality, anybody that has a fleet, could be a construction firm, mining, whatever it might be. If they use diesel fuel, we can integrate biodiesel into their fuel mix. Let us know if you're hearing or having any issues out in the countryside. We want to know those so we can help address those. And if you do have any biodiesel success stories, share those with us, and we'll be happy to amplify those messages and use those folks as spokesperson for some of the work that we do. So that wraps up some of the formal presentations for the day. And now we'll move to the Q&A portion. Please, if you have any questions, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes here. We'd love to answer any questions you have. I'll start off with the first question. Alan, you talked a little bit about supply and how biodiesel can affect things. I'll kick this to you first, and maybe Scott, you can address this as well. Actually, let's go to Scott first, and then Alan, you can address this as well. We're hearing a little bit about diesel supply issues in certain regions. Of course, we know that supplies are tight, but accessibility and supply. Scott, can you maybe address that? And then Alan, maybe talk about the impact that biodiesel can have and renewable diesel to that supply issue.
Yeah, we're hearing those rumors as well, Matt, particularly up at the end of the pipeline up in the Northeast. In fact, just this week, state of Pennsylvania has a B2 mandate, and that state just announced they are blinking that off. And so in effect, they're canceling their mandate. They're no longer going to enforce that for the next 30 days. And it's not because of biodiesel pricing. It literally is just a shortage of diesel fuel. They've got some additional state regulations that require most of their fuel dealers to purchase in-state fuel. And so they're now allowing them to go outside of state to purchase more diesel fuel as well. And truth be told, I mean, if you're just reading the headlines, the state is turning off their B2 mandate. It's really not a positive headline. But in reality, if you really get down to what's going on there, it may be a huge opportunity. What we're hearing from most of the fuel blenders in the state is that because it's really a diesel fuel shortage in supply, they may actually blend higher volumes of biodiesel, renewable diesel, if they can get it, B5, B10, B20, just to use those fuels as an extender of their existing fuel supply. So it could end up being a huge benefit to our industry.
Alan?
The only thing I would add is just to reiterate the comment that Scott made, is that it's more of a distillate issue. If you look at the overall demand in terms of gasoline and distillate, which includes not just those of us in terms of diesel fuel, you have to think of this in terms of marine as well as jet. And so we refer to it as crack spreads, and looking at the crack spread for gas versus diesel fuel, the crack spread for diesel fuel is really healthy. And so anything we can do to add capacity, to add production on the distillate side, which is what we do, is a positive.
Great. And I'll reiterate that 4% number, that cost savings you mentioned, that 20+ cents a gallon that biodiesel and others are having by having that in the supply. That's just a great story to tell. So we have a question coming in from Will Robinson. So Scott and Alan, what roadblocks are there for biofuel production to reach the 15 billion gallon mark by 2050? Could be infrastructure, policy, or other limits. I'll go to Alan first on that question.
Yes, I'll let Scott deal with changes in technology that we might see on the engine side, et cetera. A lot of my work is on the feedstock side, and so obviously, all of us on the call, we're involved in agriculture, so we know everything kind of works on the margin. So we need those signals from the marketplace to be able to say that we need to invest in additional technology. We have had huge advancements on the biotech side. If you take a look at what the life science companies have done in terms of our corn, soybean varieties, from a genetic perspective, we've had what I would call stepwise changes in terms of yield. We need to continue to have new advancement and more stepwise changes in terms of yield, in terms of productivity per acre. So we need those signals from the marketplace so that we have that lead time to be able to ramp up, because what we can't do is we can't necessarily go from 3 to 10, over 1 or 2 years. We do need those market signals in that ramp. But I would say feedstocks will be something we'll continue to have to look at to be able to expand.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Alan. It's, as you mentioned earlier, nobody's buying more French fries, just to create more used cooking oil. Nobody wants additional fat on their steak that they order at the restaurant. And certainly nobody's going to convert all of your acres to just soybeans. There are lots of benefits to that rotational value. And so as we work, I say we, it's going to be mostly Alan, on additional cover crops, additional oil seeds to bring in the market. We'll work with those, feedstocks that we can get to mix, to blend, to add the value that we're already producing for the ag industry and for consumers and diesel equipment alike.
And, I'll also mention on the infrastructure side, some of these new applications that Scott mentioned, marine, rail, the bioheat out Northeast, there are infrastructure needs. And so these are areas where, if we want to move, for instance, Midwest biodiesel out east to some of those heating oil suppliers, there's going to be some infrastructure needs. And that's really underpins the importance of the USDA HBIP program and things like that. Some of the logistics things, that will help ease logistics concerns and get more biodiesel out there. Okay, we have another question. Is there any consumer research regarding preference of biodiesel versus renewable diesel? And a follow-up to that, are there any advantages using bio or renewable or vice versa? I'll go to Scott first on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. From the consumer standpoint, there's at least a perception that biodiesel can only be used up to 20% blends. Truth is, biodiesel is registered with the EPA as a fuel in and of itself. And so there may be some advantages to higher blends. There may be some restrictions with today's engine requirements. But we can, and we are using B30, B40, B50, even B100 in certain applications. But there's that perception that renewable diesel is a drop-in fuel. It's a hydrocarbon, as I mentioned, indistinguishable from diesel fuel. So you can go all the way to R100. From a technical standpoint, and even some other perceptions, the biggest thing is cost. Because of that additional processing, the hydroprocessing for renewable diesel and SAF production, there is a significant cost increase, potentially $1.25 more per gallon than it costs to produce biodiesel. And so as we expand upon some of these markets, railroads, marine, home heating oil that are traditionally lower cost fuel markets, they're going to prefer biodiesel. On-road market, more of a drop-in fuel, higher blends for today's trucks, they may prefer renewable diesel. We'll see what the market shakes out, but particularly once you get out to the West Coast where there are low carbon fuel standards that provide more incentives for renewable diesel, we're seeing that take a larger foothold. But on the Northeast and some of these other markets like rail and marine, we're going to see a preference for biodiesel.
Alan, any comments?
Nope, Scott took care of it.
Okay. Well, we have time. I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap up here, and this is mostly geared towards Scott. You know, for the folks that are out there that, you know, have access to biodiesel and want to start using a blend, can you give us just a few quick tips on how you would suggest, you know, moving into using more biodiesel either in your farming operation or your fleet?
Yeah, keep the fuel clean and dry. Absolutely the foremost precaution to take. You know, a lot of people, if you were farming 40 years ago, there were high sulfur fuels, and it was, you know, buy your fuel, you drop it in your tank there on the farm and you drop it and forget it. Today's fuels, today's engines need a little bit more care and attention. And so keep the fuel clean and dry. And again, whether that's B0 or anything up to B100, keep the fuel clean and dry. That's going to go a long way to prevent filter plugging, to prevent water accumulation and microbial growth in your fuel. And so a little bit more turnover. I know that sounds funny, especially with today's high diesel prices, but that'll go a long way in keeping your tank cleaner, keeping the fuel clean, and you can enjoy all those added benefits that lubricity for today's high pressure common rail engines that biodiesel brings, improved emissions, less smog. There's a lot of reasons why today's soybean farmers should feel proud about what they do and the fuel and food they produce for the nation.
Well, Scott, Alan, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it. We'll go ahead and real quick do the giveaway, the Carhartt backpack. I think Samantha did a random drawing and sent me the winner. Let's see what we've got here. The winner is Larry Anderson. Larry, so if you want to stay on after the webinar closes, send me your email address and your address, and we'll get that to you. So thanks everyone. We'll have another one of these webinars next month in the Farm to Focus series, and we just thank you for taking the time today. Have a good day. Hey, Larry, can you hear me?
Hi, Larry. If you can hear us, if you would just please send your information to either sturner@mosoy.org or mamick@mosoy.org. Or as always, you can call our office here in Jefferson City and we will get you that backpack sent. Wonderful. Well, thank you. I do have him with talking permissions. So Larry, if you wanted to unmute and chat with us, you do have that ability. If not, we will just wait for your communications via email or calling our office phone. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon.